I get inundated with emails from newbies asking for advice on learning the basics of hunting and fishing. They ask me that all the time. And I always give them the same response: hire a guide. A guide is the quickest way for a newbie with no mentor available to learn how to hunt, fish, field dress, and address your equipment needs. Going blindly into the woods is an exercise in futility if you don't know what you're doing. Yes, I'll admit it, in the hunting world in particular, there's a lot of condescending people who think it's their job to look down upon people who hire guides. But I'm here to tell you, don't listen to them. They're ignorant. Even for experienced hunters and anglers, there's times where we hire guides. Sometimes you can't hunt in certain areas or in certain countries without using a licensed guide. That they aren't going to let you run around in Africa shooting at elephants without a guide. And I'll also admit that being without a bird dog right now at this time in my life, I sometimes want to hire a guide just because I like going out and watching dogs working. Sometimes that's more rewarding than the hunt itself, just watching those amazing dogs work. So I might hire a guide with a dog. I might want to hunt in an area that I'm totally unfamiliar with, and a guide makes sense for the limited amount of time I have to hunt there. And as much as I love the challenge of solo public land hunting and fishing, guides do have their place, even for experienced guys like me. The fishing world is much less condescending about hiring a guide than the hunting world is. Even the most experienced anglers among us regularly hire guides. If I want to fish offshore in the ocean, I'll hire a boat to do it. If I want to drift down the Snake River, I'll hire a guide with a drift boat. If I want to fly into a remote Alaskan location for a salmon run, I'm going to hire the best guide that I can afford. In the fishing world, hiring a guide is considered a way to support the industry as a whole. And I wish hunters looked at it that way too. So as you can see, hiring a guide is the best thing a new hunter or angler can do. There's no better way to learn the ropes and no better teachers available than guides. I also pointed out that there's many legitimate reasons for experienced hunters and anglers to also hire a guide. And now I'm going to give you some pointers on selecting a guide. Never, ever just blindly give your money to someone who calls himself a guide. Guides are just a slice of humanity, like everybody else. You have good ones and you have bad ones. Some are hardworking and some are really lazy. Some are experienced and some don't know what the hell they're doing. There's nothing more awesome than learning from a good guide, and there's nothing more frustrating than dealing with a bad guide. You have to do your research beforehand before you hire or pick a guide. This used to be hard in the old days because guides would give you a hand-picked list of references that basically consisted of people that were going to give them glowing reviews. But in the internet age, in the age of the internet that we're in right now, researching a guide is pretty easy to do. From internet forums to YouTube videos to Google, Yelp, TripAdvisor. There's a lot of reviews out there, and it's really easy to find reviews on just about any guide that you want to hire. But a word of caution when going through people's reviews of guides. You need to disregard people who complain that they didn't shoot an animal or catch a fish. Even the best guide has absolutely no control over what animals do. Animals don't always cooperate, and that's just not the guide's fault. What you should be paying attention to is the guide's work ethic, his overall demeanor, the areas that the guide hunts, and most of all, the experience and knowledge of the guide. So as important as reviews are, you need to read them with some degree of skepticism. When reading through reviews, pay particular attention to the guide's work ethic. I had a saltwater fishing guide before that just argued with his wife on the phone for 2 days straight and didn't even really seem interested in fishing. And I gave him a review and a tip that reflected that. It's also important to know the area that the guide will be hunting or fishing in, particularly if they lease rights to hunt or fish on private property. I had a guide that sat on a hill for 3 straight days, and we did nothing but glass the animals on a neighboring property because the property that he hunted on was overhunted. It was hunted out. It became apparent once I got the lay of that property that many of the deer pictures that he sent me weren't from that property. And as it turns out, that's a common thing with hunting leases. There's also a bait and switch trick that guide services like to play that you need to be aware of. Independent guides usually don't do this, but guide services are infamous for doing this. What happens is that many guide services hang their hat on the reputation of one famous guide or a couple of famous guides, and they'll lead you to believe that that's who you'll be hunting or fishing with. But when you show up, your guide ends up being a wet behind the ears 19-year-old, and your trip is part of his training. This situation almost guarantees a subpar experience. Many popular hunting and fishing places are known as meat grinders. Calling a place a meat grinder means that guides turn over a high volume of clients in a fast-paced, crowded, and stressful environment. Places like Jackson Hole, Bozeman, and Key West are meat grinders for fishing in the summer. South Dakota is a meat grinder during upland season. Idaho's a meat grinder during the elk season. Meat grinders are all about making as much money as fast as they can during a limited season. Because of this meat grinder environment, guide services need a lot of temporary guides that'll work for cheap. So it's not uncommon to get an elk guide in Idaho who was a college student and went through a quick training course before he took you out to hunt. It's very common to get fishing guides with as little as a few weeks of experience fishing. In South Dakota, half the pheasant guides don't even live in South Dakota. I have a lot of friends here in California who go there to guide. So what you can do is demand to know exactly who your guide is going to be, get his contact information, and call that guide to confirm that you'll be hunting or fishing with him. Guide services often lie just to get businesses, but individual guides are more likely to tell you the truth. That's my experience. So if you use a guide service, make sure you know who you're hunting with and confirm it with the guide himself. But honestly, I'd try to skip the guide service thing altogether and hire a reputable local guide that lives in that area and guides for a living. It'll cost you more, but you're going to get the best of the best. On the rare occasion that I'm fortunate enough to hunt or fish with a guide, they always tell me that I'm the best client. They just love Becca and myself. So I'm going to try to teach you how to be a good client. People often tell me, you should guide for a living, Desert Dog. I also know a lot of guides, many of which try to get me to join them or become partners with them. But my answer is always, abso-fucking-lutely not. I see what they deal with and go through, and there's no way in hell I have the patience and restraint to put up half the crap that they deal with. God bless those guides who bite their tongues so often so that an entitled blowhard can tell them how to do their job. God bless those guides who just smile while getting chastised when the SCI score isn't high enough to to earn a client bragging rights at their next $500 a plate SCI banquet. Some people aren't good clients because they just aren't good people to begin with. But for the rest of us, being a good client will go a long way towards the success of your experience and to the effort put forth by your guide. So the way I look at it is you put all of that effort into researching guides. You picked a guide that has a lot of experience, gets results, and has tons of happy clients. So at this point, it's up to you to trust their decisions because that's what you're paying them for. That guide knows the area and the animals in that area better than you ever will. So listening to your guide is the best thing you can do on your hunting trip. I've seen guides do things that just absolutely made no sense to me, but in the end, it got results. So don't second guess the guide or attempt to correct them. You're paying for their extensive experience. Secondly, be prepared for the trip before you go. Become proficient with your firearm and the safety of handling a firearm before showing up for a hunt. Whether you know it or not, your guide will immediately size up your ability to safely handle and use a firearm. And the degree to which that guide's going to trust you depends on that assessment. The more the guide trusts you, the more options you'll have available on the hunt. And I firmly believe that. For fishing trips, especially fly fishing, make sure you know how to cast and mend before you step on a drift boat. The more time that guide spends rowing, the more time you have catching fish. Also, a positive attitude and positive mindset just goes a long way. Grumpy, irritable people who constantly put out negative vibes are known as trip killers. You're there to enjoy nature and the thrill and challenge of pursuing wild fish and game. You should be happy to be there. Otherwise, why even go? So always start a fishing or hunting trip with a smile and an open mind. And lastly, you need to have realistic expectations. As I alluded to earlier, the guide has no control over what the animals do. Don't rate your overall experience on killing an animal or catching lots of fish. Filling up a cooler with venison or releasing a huge fish is a bonus, not a guarantee. All you can expect out of a guide is hard work, great instruction, and a good attitude. Anything outside of that is out of their hands, and you need to understand that. If you take my advice and you trust your guide, prepare for your trip, have a positive attitude, and have realistic expectations, you'll make a great client that any guide would be happy to hunt or fish with. Now I'm going to talk about rates for guided hunts. In most countries outside the United States, you pay a combination of daily rates and trophy fees. The daily rates are the total cost of the guide, the staff, the supplies, and the accommodations. But the trophy fees are what you pay if you kill an animal. Under this system, if you don't kill an animal, you don't pay for it. This system is common in Africa, and I really like it personally. In North America, most guides charge you a fixed rate, meaning that everything is included in the price. But if you don't kill an animal, you still pay for it. So it's very common for guys to go on $30,000 Alaskan hunts and get nothing. A guy in my local club spent over $10,000 on an elk hunt 2 years ago and didn't even see an elk the whole time. So please be mindful of this before doing a guided hunt in North America. This comes to a shock to many foreigners. Also, when you book a hunt, you'll often be asked to provide a deposit. Read the fine print on this deposit because it's often not refundable. Basically, the guide is holding those dates open for you. So if you cancel, it's money out of their pocket that he would have made if somebody else booked those dates ahead of time. So always study the payment details carefully. Also, I want to let you know that a lot of people look at the prices of guided hunts and they go, "Oh, that's a ripoff. That's way too expensive." But they're not factoring in the amount of time and preparation that guide went through before you got there. I mean, he did scouting. He maybe set up areas where you're going to camp. He did a lot of work before you even got there to hunt. So you're basically paying for that. If you were to do that on your own on a solo public land hunt without the guide, you'd probably spend an extra, 3 to 4 days doing what the guide did before you got there. So in actuality, the price of a guided hunt isn't that bad when you factor that extra time in. And now I'm going to attempt to tackle the most controversial aspect of a guided hunt, and that's leaving tips. Leaving tips means many different things to many different people. The range of tips varies from European and Asian hunters who don't tip at all to some wealthy American hunters that might tip 50% or more. At the end of the day, though, a tip must be earned. Never tip just to do it. Leave a tip based on how much the guide and his staff met or exceeded your expectations. Myself, I'd never leave a 50% tip. I think that's ridiculous. But I'd also never leave my guide, camp staff, or boat without a tip if they did a good job. A general rule of thumb is to tip 20% of the guide's total cost if they do a great job and exceed your expectations. 15% tips are common if they did a decent job. And if you get a bad guide, you can scale it down to whatever you feel is appropriate. I won't go into that. Africa hunts are a different animal entirely because they involve an entire staff of people to ensure a successful hunt. You'll be tipping the PH, your trackers, maybe a driver, and the camp staff. For a simple, quick plains game hunt on a high fence South African property, I'd probably budget about $600 or $700 for the PH as a tip and about $400 extra for the staff and your tracker. Of course, for dangerous game hunts in remote areas of Africa, I'd tip much more for greater service because of the higher level of danger, tough logistics, longer duration of the hunt, and the difficulty of the hunt. But always consider tips flexible. I wounded a gemsbok one time, and my PH and tracker worked for hours, for about half a day, to recover that animal in 100-degree heat. Needless to say, they got a much better tip than I had originally planned because they just went the extra mile in my mind. So tips should be merit-based. Also, make sure you find out how tips are supposed to be distributed. At some hunt camps and on some fishing boats, you tip each member of the staff separately. But other times, you give the tip money to the PH or to a captain, and he distributes it. I had an African PH about 4 years ago that wanted to hold all the tip money and distribute it to his staff at the end of the season. The problem was that when the clients would give camp staff money at the end of their hunts, those workers would disappear into the nearest town and live it up and party. And the PH wouldn't have enough camp staff for the next group of hunters that came into camp. So if you hunt or fish in a situation where there's multiple people involved that need to be tipped, clear up the situation with the person in charge before you start just handing out money to people. Also, don't consider gifts as tips. Every hunting guide in the world out there has just a chest full of custom knives and other things given to them by clients. Guides have bills to pay and mouths to feed, and a custom knife for a new fishing rod isn't going to do that. Always tip in cash. And lastly, Make sure you tip in the proper currency. You'd be surprised to learn that how many Americans and Europeans think that dollars and euros are good everywhere, but they're not. And if you do tip in American currency, make sure you pay with new bills. They don't like old bills. In conclusion, I hope that this video provided you with valuable information on hunting and fishing with guides. And I hope it gave you a better understanding of the guide-client relationship. Guides really are the backbone of the hunting and fishing industry. They drive product development and conservation efforts. They instill knowledge and confidence into new hunters and anglers and provide great opportunities to experienced guys like me. Well, that wraps up this video. You can reach me with any questions or comments at desertdogoutdoors@gmail.com. And as always, thanks for watching and good hunting.